Right now, as you're listening to these words, somewhere in a data center, in a long row of server racks heated to the temperature of a human body, there is a program running that can write poetry, make medical diagnoses, translate from languages its creators don't speak, and carry on conversations that leave some people with the feeling that there is someone alive on the other side of the screen. This program was never programmed to do any of these things. Nobody wrote grammar rules for it. Nobody explained to it what irony is. Nobody taught it to tell a healthy lung X-ray from a diseased one. It simply read nearly every piece of text humanity has ever written, and somehow it learned. How exactly, we don't fully understand. We built it. We know every line of its code. We know the architecture. We know what data it was trained on. And yet, when it produces an answer that amazes us, we cannot say with certainty how it arrived at it. What will remain uniquely human when a machine can write, draw, reason, and even surprise the people who built it? Why are we so ready to believe a machine understands us, even when we know for a fact that it doesn't? What turned out to be harder for a computer? Proving a mathematical theorem, or figuring out that the person in the doorway is smiling? Can a machine that has never seen a single human chess game rediscover in a few hours everything it took us centuries to learn, and find beauty we missed? If we built this system, if we know every line of its code, if we know exactly what it was trained on, why can't we explain how it arrives at its answers? And here is what's truly strange. We don't understand how this program works for almost the same reason we don't understand how our own brain works. 3 pounds of soft tissue inside your skull, 86 billion neurons, each one connected to thousands of others. Right now, you are using this organ to listen to my words, to turn sound waves into meaning, to conjure images, to feel curiosity. And yet, if I asked you to explain exactly how you do it, how exactly you understand a sentence you've never heard before in your life, you couldn't. Nobody can. Neuroscientists have been working on this for over 100 years and still haven't arrived at a complete answer. So we find ourselves in a curious situation. We built a machine loosely modeled on our own brain. The machine started doing things that surprise us. And now we're staring at it, trying to figure out how it thinks. And in the process, we're forced to ask ourselves all over again how we think. We were building a mirror. 50 years if you count from the beginning of serious research. 2,500 years if you count from the first philosophical questions about the nature of the mind.
And now that the mirror is finally large enough and clear enough to make something out in it, we peer into it and see our own reflection. And, to be honest, we're not quite sure what to make of it. That's what we're going to talk about tonight. We'll walk through the entire history of artificial intelligence, from the very first dreams of thinking machines to the systems that are now reshaping medicine, science, economics, and possibly the very fabric of human civilization. We'll take our time. We'll get to know the people who made this history, with their obsessions, their failures, their moments of insight in the middle of the night. And at every turn, we'll ask ourselves one question. What did this next step in building a thinking machine tell us about ourselves? What did we learn about our own minds by trying to recreate them in silicon and code? Because maybe the most surprising thing about the history of artificial intelligence is that it was never really about the machines.
It was always about us. Get comfortable. If you drift off somewhere along the way, that's perfectly fine. The story isn't going anywhere. It's been waiting for 2,500 years. It can wait a little longer. Let's start with something very simple. Imagine a pebble, smooth, round, resting in the palm of your hand. Now set it down next to another pebble. 2 pebbles, that's it. That's where our story begins. The Latin word calculus means small stone. The word calculator comes from it, And every spreadsheet you've ever opened, every algorithm quietly running on your phone right now, every bank transaction on the planet, all of it traces back, in a sense, to a person who thousands of years ago placed one small stone next to another and used them to count. The need to count is older than writing, older than cities, older than farming. There's a bone called the Ishango bone. It was found near the headwaters of the Nile in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's roughly 20,000 years old. A small piece of a baboon's fibula with notches carved into it. Groups of notches arranged in distinct patterns. Archaeologists have argued for decades about what they mean. Some thought it was simply a tally stick, someone tracking trades or lunar cycles. Others noticed something curious. The groupings seem to correspond to prime numbers and a doubling pattern. We can't know for certain what the person who carved it was thinking, but we do know one thing. They used a physical object to represent abstract quantities. They offloaded information from their head onto something external. And that impulse, that desire to build a tool that helps manage information too complex to hold in your mind, is something we'll be tracing through the entire story, right to the very end. For thousands of years, the primary computing tools were exactly these kinds of things. Fingers, stones, notches in clay, knots on string. The Inca civilization used quipu, elaborate systems of knotted cords, sometimes with hundreds of strings hanging from a single main cord. Each knot encoded a number depending on its type and position. Spanish colonizers in the 16th century encountered quipu and were completely baffled. And yet the Incas used them to run an empire. Tax records, census data, stores of grain and livestock, all encoded in knots. An entire imperial bureaucracy running on string. But the tool that truly dominated the ancient world, the one that lasted longer and spread farther than any other, was the abacus. And here's the thing. People tend to think of it as something primitive, almost toy-like. It's nothing of the sort. A skilled abacus operator can add, subtract, multiply and divide with astonishing speed. There are well-documented competitions from the mid-20th century where abacus masters went up against people using electric calculators. And the abacus masters won. Not every time, but often enough to make the point. The earliest abacus-like devices show up in Mesopotamia around the 27th century BCE, though the dating is approximate. The version most people picture, beads on rods in a wooden frame, is the Chinese swan pan, which has been in use for at least 1,000 years, probably longer. The Japanese soroban is a refined version with fewer beads per rod, optimized for speed. Russian shoti used horizontal wires with 10 beads on each. Every major civilization independently arrived at some version of this idea, representing numbers with physical objects that you can move around. Such a natural human solution. But here's what I want you to notice. All of these tools, tally sticks, quipu, the abacus, they help you count, but they don't count for you. You still have to know the procedure. You still have to know that multiplication requires such and such a sequence of steps. The tool holds the numbers, but your brain does the logic. The tool is passive, and the jump from a passive tool to an active machine to something that actually carries out the steps for you, something you set up and it delivers the answer, that jump took a surprisingly long time, thousands of years. But running alongside the history of calculation was another history, and in some ways, it's even more ancient. A history not of making a machine that counts, but of making a machine that thinks. And it begins with a dream far older than any calculator. The ancient Greeks thought about this earlier than almost anyone else. In Greek mythology, there is a figure named Hephaestus, god of fire and of the forge, the divine craftsman. Homer describes him in the Iliad, and here is what's remarkable. Hephaestus doesn't just forge weapons and armor, he builds automatons, golden handmaidens that can move on their own, that possess reason and speech and skill. He builds Talos, a giant bronze man who patrols the shores of Crete and hurls boulders at enemy ships. These aren't just decorative myths. They express a deep human intuition. If you're clever enough, if you understand materials and mechanisms well enough, you can build something that behaves as if it were alive. And if you think about it, already in these myths you can see the seed of the mirror idea we were talking about. Why do humans want to build something that thinks? One of the deepest answers is this: to understand, through building it, how thinking works in themselves. When Homer described Hephaestus's golden handmaidens, you may not have realized it, but he was posing a question that humanity would spend the next 2,500 years asking. If we build something that behaves like an intelligent being, will it help us understand what intelligence actually is? The Greeks, of course, didn't have the technology to bring any of this to life. But they didn't just dream. Around the 3rd century BCE, real engineers of the ancient world began building actual mechanical devices that mimicked living creatures. Ctesibius of Alexandria, sometimes called the father of pneumatics, built water clocks, hydraulic organs, and mechanical birds that could sing. His student, or at least his intellectual heir, Hero of Alexandria, who lived in the 1st century CE, wrote entire books about automata, mechanical devices powered by water, steam, air pressure, and falling weights. Hero described a miniature theatre where tiny figures moved on their own, acting out a play. Nobody pulled the strings. The mechanism ran by itself, following a predetermined sequence. Think about that for a second. 2,000 years ago, someone built a programmable sequence of mechanical actions. It's not intelligence, not by any modern definition, but it is the seed of an idea. The realization that you can encode a set of instructions into a physical system and let it run on its own.
And that idea, the notion of a machine following a program, turns out to be absolutely central to everything that comes after. Jump forward roughly 1,000 years, and we see the same impulse surfacing in the golden age of Islam. In the early 13th century, a brilliant engineer named Ismail al-Jazari, working in what is now southeastern Turkey, wrote a book with a wonderful title, The Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices. Al-Jazari built water clocks, musical automata, and the famous Peacock Fountain, where mechanical servants offered soap and towels. But what's really interesting about his work is something else. Some of his devices used what we would now call early forms of programmable logic. Pegs on a rotating drum determined which actions would occur and in what order. The same basic principle that would later drive music boxes, player pianos, and ultimately, in a far more abstract form, the first computers.
So running through all of human history is this thread, this restless drive to build machines that behave as if they have minds. And for most of that history, the machines were purely mechanical. Gears, levers, water, weights. Intelligence, whatever it was baked into the physical structure. You couldn't change the program without rebuilding the machine. But people kept trying, kept inventing, kept asking themselves, how far can we go? And then, in the 17th century, something fundamentally shifted. People began to think seriously not just about mechanical bodies, but about mechanical minds, about whether thinking itself might be a kind of mechanism. And the person who crystallized that question more clearly than anyone else was René Descartes. You probably know him from I think, therefore I am. But Descartes was also deeply fascinated by automata. He lived in an era when elaborate mechanical toys were fashionable at European courts. Lifelike dolls that could write, draw, play music. Descartes looked at these machines and asked a truly deep question. If a machine can imitate the actions of a living being, is there any action a machine could never imitate? His answer was yes. He believed that language, real, flexible language, was the dividing line. You could build a machine that utters words, he reasoned, but it could never arrange them in new ways to respond meaningfully to everything said to it. Only a soul could do that. And here's the interesting part. Descartes was the same person who described animals as biological machines, complex automata without souls, operating on purely mechanical principles. So, in Descartes' system, the human body is a machine, animals are machines, but the human mind is something different, something non-mechanical, something standing outside the physical world. A strange and fascinating position. And it set up a debate that would rage for centuries. Is the mind something fundamentally different from a machine? Or is it just a very, very complicated one? This question, can a machine think, became the philosophical engine driving the entire history of artificial intelligence. Every breakthrough, every failure, every furious argument in the field traces back to some version of it. And for a long time it remained purely philosophical, because nobody had the tools to actually test it. But meanwhile, on a completely different track, people were learning to make machines that calculate. And the first person to really pull it off, at least the first we know much about, was a 19-year-old who watched his father adding up columns of numbers until he was exhausted and decided to do something about it. Blaise Pascal was born in 1623 in Clermont-Ferrand, France. His father, Etienne, was a tax commissioner, essentially a government accountant. And Etienne's work involved endless, grinding arithmetic, column after column of numbers, additions that had to be checked and rechecked day after day. Young Blaise watched his father churn through this work and decided to build a machine that would do it for him. Pascal was a prodigy, genuinely, without exaggeration. By 16, he had written a significant mathematical treatise on conic sections. That kind of mind comes along once a generation. And starting around 1642, when he was just 19, he began designing and building a mechanical calculator. He called it the Pascaline. The device used a series of interlocking gears, 6 in the original design, later expanded to 8, each representing a decimal digit. You entered numbers by turning small wheels on the front panel, and the gears inside performed addition, including carries. And this is worth pausing on, because the carry is actually the key problem. Think about what addition requires mechanically. You need a way to represent digits, say, wheels with the numbers 0 through 9 on their edges. You turn a wheel to the right digit. Great. But what happens when you add 7 and 8? You get 15. The ones digit is 5, but you need to carry a 1 into the tens place. That carry operation, that's where the real complexity lives. Because mechanically, it means that when one wheel rolls past 9 and back to 0, it has to reach over and nudge the next wheel forward by exactly 1 position. And that nudge has to be precise. It has to happen every time, reliably, with no jamming, no slipping, no gear wear. And if you have a cascading carry, like adding 999 plus 1, where every digit has to carry, then you get a chain reaction of carries rippling through the entire machine. Building a mechanism that handles this elegantly is a genuinely hard engineering problem.
Pascal used an ingenious solution. A part called a sautoir, a kind of weighted ratchet that accumulated energy as a digit wheel approached 9, and then released it all at once to advance the next wheel. Elegant, inventive, and incredibly difficult to manufacture. Pascal, by most accounts, went through roughly 50 prototypes. 50. The craftsmen of 17th century France were skilled, but the tolerances Pascal demanded were at the very limit of their capabilities. Every gear had to mesh perfectly with its neighbors. The slightest defect, a tooth fractionally too thick, an axle slightly off-center, and the whole machine would jam or give wrong answers. Despite all his efforts, the Pascaline never became a commercial success. They were too expensive to produce, too finicky, too hard to repair. Only about 20 were ever built, and most ended up as curiosities for wealthy collectors. But the significance of the Pascaline lies elsewhere. Pascal proved it was possible.
A machine can add numbers, not a human using a tool. A machine doing it itself through the interaction of its own internal parts. You set the inputs, turn the crank, and the answer appears. That's a conceptual leap. And once that idea was out in the world, other people started building on it. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the German mathematician who, among many other things, co-invented calculus alongside Newton, built his step reckoner in 1673. It could not only add and subtract, like the Pascaline, but also multiply and divide. And Leibniz did something else that, for our story, is perhaps even more important than his calculator. He invented the binary number system, ones and zeros. Every number represented using only two symbols. Leibniz saw an almost mystical beauty in this. One as God, zero as the void, and from their combination, all of creation. Practical application of this idea was still 2.5 centuries away. But when it came, it changed the world. Every computer, every smartphone, every server on the planet runs on Leibniz's ones and zeros. And Leibniz dreamed of something more. He wanted to create what he called a calculus ratiocinator, a logical calculus that would allow reasoning to be replaced by calculation. Instead of arguing, he said, "Let us calculate. Let us build a reasoning machine." For 250 years, that idea remained a dream. And then, in the 19th century, a man appeared who tried to turn it into metal. His name was Charles Babbage, an English mathematician and inventor who spent a significant portion of his career trying to build what he called the analytical engine, a universal mechanical computer designed in the 1830s. It was staggeringly ahead of its time. It had a memory, which Babbage called the store, a processor, which he called the mill. The machine could branch, making decisions based on intermediate results, and following different sequences of instructions depending on what it found. In every meaningful sense, it was a programmable computer, designed more than a century before the first electronic ones appeared. Babbage never finished building it. The engineering challenges were immense, thousands of precision-machined brass gears, and the manufacturing tolerances of the 1830s were simply not sufficient. He spent decades and enormous sums of money, and the full analytical engine was never completed in his lifetime. But the design was sound. Modern engineers have built portions of it, and they work exactly as Babbage predicted. And this is where Ada Lovelace enters the story. She was the daughter of Lord Byron, the poet, though she never knew her father. Her mother, determined that Ada would not inherit Byron's romantic temperament, ensured she received intensive training in mathematics and logic. And Ada turned out to be extraordinary. She met Babbage at a party when she was 17, became fascinated by his machines, and eventually wrote a series of notes on the analytical engine that went far beyond anything Babbage himself had published. In those notes, written in 1843, Ada did two things that would prove incredibly important for our story. First, she wrote what is widely considered the first computer program, a detailed algorithm for computing Bernoulli numbers on the analytical engine. Second, and for us this matters even more, she wrote about the philosophical implications of the machine. She said that the analytical engine makes no pretense to originating anything. It can do whatever we know how to order it to perform. It can follow analysis, but it has no power of anticipating any analytical relations or truths. This statement, sometimes called Lady Lovelace's objection, would echo through the entire history of artificial intelligence.
A machine can only do what it's programmed to do. It can never truly create, think, or surprise us. And for over 100 years, most people agreed. But Ada also hinted at something else. Something that shows how far ahead she was looking. She suggested that the machine might one day compose music. Not because it would feel anything, but because musical composition follows rules, and rules can be encoded. She was imagining, in 1843, a machine capable of producing creative output by manipulating symbols according to formal rules. That idea, that intelligence might be symbol manipulation, would become one of the foundational concepts of artificial intelligence, when the field finally emerged a century later. So by the middle of the 19th century, all the philosophical ingredients were on the table. The ancient dream of the automaton. Descartes' question about whether minds are machines. Babbage's design for a universal computer.
Ada Lovelace's insight that such a machine could manipulate symbols, follow complex programs, and perhaps even produce things that look creative. And her objection that a machine could never truly originate anything new. All the pieces were on the board. What was missing was the mathematics to make it all rigorous, and the technology to make it all real. And that is exactly what the 20th century would provide, in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. Because the man who would lay the mathematical foundation for artificial intelligence, who would define what computation is, who would ask the question, can a machine think, in a way that could actually be tested? That man was about to be born in London, in 1912, to a family of civil servants. His name was Alan Turing, and his story is one of the most brilliant, tragic, and consequential in modern science. Alan Turing.
Quiet, a little awkward, the kind of person who ran marathons alone to clear his head, and sometimes chained his mug to the radiator so nobody would steal it. Brilliant, obviously. But in 1936, not yet famous. He was 23 years old, a graduate student at King's College, Cambridge, and he was thinking about a problem that looked, on the surface, like pure abstract mathematics, as far from practical engineering as it was possible to get. The problem had been posed by the German mathematician David Hilbert, and the question sounded deceptively simple. Is there a mechanical procedure that can determine whether any given mathematical statement is true or false? Hilbert believed the answer was yes. He had a grand vision for mathematics. He wanted to show that all of mathematics could be placed on a solid mechanical foundation, that every true statement could be proved, every false one disproved, and that the whole system would be consistent and complete. A grand vision, and many very smart people shared it. The idea was that mathematics was, at its core, a perfect machine, and all you needed was the right procedure to turn the crank. But by 1936, the cracks had already appeared. A few years earlier, in 1931, a young Austrian logician named Kurt Gödel had published his incompleteness theorems. He showed that any sufficiently powerful mathematical system would contain true statements that could not be proved within that system. That was already a blow to Hilbert's program. But the specific decision problem, the question of whether a general mechanical procedure for determining truth existed, remained open. Turing's approach to answering this question was unlike anything that had been attempted before. Instead of diving straight into logic, he did something incredibly simple. He asked himself, what do we actually mean by a mechanical procedure? What does it mean to perform a computation?
And to answer that, he imagined a person, just a human being, sitting at a desk, following rules, writing symbols on paper. What is that person actually doing? What are the simplest possible operations they perform? And from this thought experiment, Turing conjured into existence what we now call a Turing machine. Not a physical machine, he never built one. It was a mathematical abstraction, a thought experiment, an imaginary device. And here's what it looked like. Imagine an infinitely long tape divided into cells. Each cell can hold a symbol,
say a 0, a 1, or a blank. There's a read-write head that sits over one cell at a time. It can read the symbol in that cell, write a new symbol, and then move one cell to the left or right. And it has a set of rules, a table of instructions, that tells it what to do based on two things: the symbol it's currently reading and the internal state it's in. That's it. That's the whole machine.
Read a symbol, check the state. Write a symbol, move left or right. Change state. Repeat. Sounds almost absurdly simple, doesn't it? Like a toy. But here is what Turing showed. This little machine with its tape, its head, and its table of rules can compute anything that is computable. Anything at all. Any computation ever performed or ever to be performed by any computer, from adding two numbers to rendering a movie to running a neural network, could, in principle, be carried out by a Turing machine. It might take an absurdly long time. It might require an absurdly long tape, but it could do it. This is the Church-Turing thesis, and it's one of the most profound ideas in all of science. And then Turing did something even more ingenious. He showed that you could build a universal Turing machine, a single machine that could simulate any other Turing machine. You simply encode the instructions of the machine you want to simulate as symbols on the tape, feed them in, and the universal machine reads those instructions and executes them. Think about what that means. It's a stored program computer. The idea that a program is just data, that a single machine can do anything depending on what instructions you give it. This is the conceptual blueprint for every computer you have ever used. And Turing described it in 1936 in a paper about mathematical logic, a decade before the first electronic computers were built. But the real purpose of the paper, what Turing was actually trying to prove, was about limits. He used his machine to show that there are problems no Turing machine can solve. Specifically, he showed that the halting problem is undecidable. The halting problem asks, given a Turing machine and an input, can you determine in advance whether that machine will eventually stop or will run forever? Turing proved, through a beautiful diagonal argument similar in spirit to Cantor's proof, that there are more real numbers than natural numbers, that no general procedure can answer this question for all possible machines and inputs. There will always be cases where you simply cannot predict what the machine will do without running it and waiting, possibly forever. And there was the answer to Hilbert. No, there is no universal mechanical procedure for determining mathematical truth. The decision problem is undecidable. Mathematics is not a mechanism whose crank you can turn. There are inherent limits to what computation can do. After the war, Turing turned directly to the question of machine intelligence. He worked on early electronic computer projects, first ACE at the National Physical Laboratory, then the Manchester Mark I at the University of Manchester. These were real physical machines now, not thought experiments. Vacuum tubes instead of imaginary tapes. And Turing was thinking seriously about what these machines might become. In 1950, he published a paper in the journal Mind titled Computing Machinery and Intelligence. It opens with one of the most famous lines in the history of science. I propose to consider the question, can machines think? And almost immediately he makes a flanking move. He says the words think and machine are too vague, too loaded with philosophical baggage to be useful. Instead, he proposes a test, essentially a game. He calls it the imitation game, though today we know it as the Turing test. Here's how it works. You have a human judge who can communicate via text with two respondents in another room. One is a human, the other is a machine. The judge asks questions, reads the answers, and tries to figure out which is which. If the machine can fool the judge, if its responses are indistinguishable from a human's, then, Turing argues, we have no good reason to deny that the machine thinks.
not because it necessarily has consciousness or feelings, but because we have no better evidence of thinking in other people either. We judge intelligence by behavior, by conversation, by reactions. If a machine passes the test, on what basis can we say it isn't intelligent? And here again, the mirror. Think about what Turing actually did. He didn't answer the question, "Can a machine think?" He flipped it. He asked, "How do you define thinking in another person?" And the honest answer is, by behavior. We can't peer inside anyone's head. We judge the presence of a mind by how a being acts, responds, reacts. Turing simply said, "Let's apply the same standard to a machine." And if that bothers us, then maybe we should also be bothered by how shaky our criteria for intelligence are in general. The paper was also remarkable for how Turing anticipated nearly every objection that would be raised against artificial intelligence over the next 70 years. He addressed the theological objection that thinking is a function of the soul and machines don't have souls. He addressed Lady Lovelace's objection, remember her, that machines can never originate anything, only do what we tell them. Turing's response was characteristically sharp. "How do we know," he asked, "that humans originate anything? Maybe we too are simply following rules we don't fully understand." He even made a prediction. He suggested that by the year 2000, computers with roughly 100 megabytes of memory would be able to play the imitation game well enough to fool a human judge about 30% of the time after 5 minutes of questioning. That prediction turned out to be roughly correct, depending on how strict your scoring criteria are, which is pretty impressive for 1950. Turing also sketched, in broad strokes, 2 possible approaches to building an intelligent machine. The first he called a top-down approach, programming the machine with all the rules and knowledge it needs, essentially encoding human intelligence directly. The second he called a child-machine approach, building a simple machine that can learn from experience, the way a child learns, gradually acquiring knowledge and abilities through interaction with its environment. That second idea, the learning machine, was decades ahead of its time. It is, in essence, the idea underlying modern machine learning. Turing saw it in 1950. Now, imagine Bletchley Park during the war years, a sprawling estate where some of the most brilliant minds in Britain were gathered. Mathematicians, linguists, chess players, crossword specialists. Hundreds of people working under the strictest secrecy on a task upon which millions of lives depended. Turing among them. Not the most visible, not the most charismatic. Quiet, a bit odd. That habit of chaining his mug to the radiator. Running. Not for fitness, but to think. Long, solitary runs through the countryside around Bletchley while he worked through ciphers and machines in his head. His contribution to the victory was enormous, but classified. For decades after the war, the world didn't know what Turing and his colleagues had done at Bletchley Park. Their work wasn't declassified until the 70s. Until then, Turing couldn't tell anyone, not friends, not family, not colleagues, that he had possibly done more for the war effort than any single individual. But Turing's story doesn't have a happy ending. In 1952, he was prosecuted for homosexuality, which was a criminal offense in Britain at the time. He was convicted and given a choice between prison and chemical castration. He chose hormonal treatment, injections of synthetic estrogen. The side effects were cruel: breast tissue growth, mood swings, physical changes to his body. His security clearance was revoked. He could no longer consult for the government on cryptography, the field where his contribution had been beyond measure. For 2 years, he lived with the consequences. On the 7th of June, 1954, he was found dead at his home in Wilmslow, Cheshire. A half-eaten apple lay beside him. The autopsy showed cyanide poisoning. The official verdict was suicide. He was 41 years old. There's a theory that his death may have been accidental. Turing experimented with chemicals at home,
and may have accidentally poisoned himself. His mother believed this version until the end of her life. We will never know for certain. It took nearly 60 years for Britain to acknowledge the monstrousness of what had been done. In 2009, Prime Minister Gordon Brown issued a formal apology. In 2013, the Queen granted Turing a posthumous royal pardon. In 2021, his face appeared on the British £50 note.
But Turing never saw any of what grew from his ideas. Never saw the first chess programs playing at a serious level. Never saw the internet that made possible the massive datasets on which neural networks are trained. Never saw AlphaGo and its astonishing move 37. Never saw GPT talking to millions of people. He saw none of it. He died alone in a small house in a suburb of Manchester, in a country that punished him for who he was. Every time you use a computer, any computer, from a smartphone to a server, from a gaming console to a supercomputer, you are using the legacy of Alan Turing. His universal machine is the theoretical blueprint for every one of them. Every time someone asks, "Can a machine think?" that question was posed by Turing. Every time a neural network learns from data, becoming a little smarter with each iteration, it is realizing the idea of the child machine that Turing described decades before it could be built. We lost him too early. We lost him through our own fault. And all we can do now is remember. Remember that behind every idea stands a person, and that person deserves not only intellectual recognition, but simple human compassion. And ideas need communities to grow. In the early 1950s, the community that would build AI was just beginning to find itself. Scattered across universities and research labs in the United States and Britain, small groups of people, mathematicians, psychologists, electrical engineers, neurophysiologists, all of them, independently, were circling around the same questions. And they were about to come together in a way that would give their field a name, a mission, and a sense of boundless optimism. The event that catalyzed all of this would take place in the summer of 1956 at a small liberal arts college in New Hampshire. And it would begin with a young mathematician who had a very specific idea about what he wanted to achieve, and a very specific phrase he wanted to describe it with. That phrase was artificial intelligence. John McCarthy. Here's a person worth getting to know, because he is perhaps one of those figures who doesn't always get the public recognition he deserves, even though he, more than almost anyone else, is responsible for the existence of AI as a separate discipline. McCarthy was born in 1927 in Boston, son of an Irish immigrant father and a Lithuanian Jewish mother. Both parents were active in left-wing politics during the Great Depression. The family moved to Los Angeles when John was still small, partly for his mother's health, and McCarthy turned out to be one of those children who are obviously, almost absurdly gifted in mathematics. He taught himself college-level math from textbooks while still in high school. When he entered Caltech as an undergraduate, he was already so far ahead that he attended graduate courses. He earned his doctorate at Princeton in 1951, and by then his interests had already shifted from pure mathematics to something harder to define. He was fascinated by the idea of machine intelligence, not as a philosophical question, but as an engineering challenge. He wanted to build it, or at least understand what it would take to build it. McCarthy was far from alone. In the early 50s, there was a remarkable convergence of people from completely different fields, all independently stumbling onto the same ideas from different directions. At IBM, a man named Arthur Samuel was quietly doing something unusual, building a program that played checkers and actually learned from its own experience. Samuel came to IBM in 1949 and started building this checkers program, partly to demonstrate what computers could do, partly because he was genuinely curious whether a machine could improve its own performance without being explicitly told how. And here's what was clever about Samuel's approach. He didn't just program the rules of checkers and a fixed strategy. He gave the program a way to evaluate board positions, how many pieces you have, how many kings, how well you control the center, and then let it play against itself. Thousands and thousands of games. The program adjusted its evaluation function based on what led to wins and what led to losses. This was, in essence, machine learning, decades before the term became a buzzword. And then there was Marvin Minsky, a New Yorker, brilliant and eclectic. He studied mathematics at Harvard, served in the Navy, then went to Princeton for his doctorate, where he built something remarkable. This was 1951. The machine was called SNARC, the Stochastic Neural Analog Reinforcement Calculator, one of the first artificial neural networks ever physically built, rather than simulated on a computer. Vacuum tubes and surplus parts, simulating a network of 40 neurons. And the thing was designed to learn. Specifically, to learn to navigate a virtual maze, adjusting the strength of connections between its artificial neurons based on success and failure. Crude, limited, but it worked. The machine learned. Alan Newell and Herbert Simon, working at the Rand Corporation and Carnegie Mellon University, were developing what they called the logic theorist, a program that could prove mathematical theorems from Whitehead and Russell's Principia Mathematica. They finished it in 1955, and it successfully proved 38 of the first 52 theorems in the book. For one theorem, it found a proof more elegant than the original. A machine in 1955 was doing something that looked very much like creative mathematical reasoning. Newell and Simon were so excited that they submitted their proof to the Journal of Symbolic Logic, listing the logic theorist as a co-author. The journal rejected the paper. The editors, apparently, were not ready for mathematics written by a machine. So there were all these people, McCarthy, Minsky, Samuel, Newell, Simon, and others, working on related problems but scattered across different institutions, using different terminology, coming from different intellectual traditions. What was missing was a way to bring them together, to create a shared identity and a shared agenda. And that is exactly what McCarthy set out to do. In the fall of 1955, McCarthy drafted a proposal for a summer research workshop. He enlisted 3 co-authors, Minsky, Claude Shannon from Bell Labs, the same Shannon who essentially invented information theory, and Nathaniel Rochester from IBM. The proposal was sent to the Rockefeller Foundation, requesting funding for what McCarthy called a 2-month study of artificial intelligence by a group of 10 men. And right here, in this proposal, is the first known use of the term artificial intelligence. McCarthy chose it quite deliberately, and not everyone was happy. The thing is, the name of a field shapes how people think about it. There were other options. Some people talked about automata studies. Others preferred complex information processing. Norbert Wiener, the mathematician at MIT who founded cybernetics, thought all of this activity fell under his umbrella. McCarthy wanted none of it. He specifically did not want to be under the wing of cybernetics, partly because he considered Wiener's approach too focused on analog systems and continuous mathematics, and partly, and here's the political part, because he wanted to found a new field with its own identity, not a sub-department of someone else's creation. The term artificial intelligence was bold, maybe even provocative. It made a claim. It said, "We're trying to build intelligence, not model it, not study it from the outside. Build it." The Rockefeller Foundation approved the proposal, and in the summer of 1956, roughly 10 researchers gathered at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. It's worth being honest about what the workshop actually looked like, because the mythology around it sometimes presents it as a dramatic founding moment where brilliant minds gathered and the field of AI sprang forth fully formed. The reality was messier and more human. Not everyone came at the same time. People drifted in and out over the summer. The group was small. The discussions informal. No grand manifesto was produced, no founding document that everyone signed. By most accounts, the participants didn't even agree with each other on many things. But here is what the Dartmouth workshop actually did, and it's no small thing. It gave the field a name. It created a network. These people now knew each other, argued with each other, ate together, talked late into the night. And it established a sense of mission, a feeling that this was a real research program, not idle speculation. The participants left Dartmouth believing that artificial intelligence was achievable, and most of them thought it was achievable soon. And what followed Dartmouth was a period of extraordinary optimism, truly extraordinary. The predictions that came out of this era are, in retrospect, almost breathtaking in their confidence.
In 1958, Newell and Simon predicted that within 10 years, a computer would be world chess champion. That didn't happen until 1997. They also predicted that within 10 years, a computer would discover and prove an important new mathematical theorem. Simon later raised the stakes, predicting in 1965 that within 20 years, machines would be capable of doing any work a human could do. That would have been 1985. It goes without saying that this did not happen. But here's the thing. This optimism wasn't irrational. It wasn't wishful thinking from people who didn't understand the problems. These were some of the smartest people on the planet, and they had real grounds for confidence. The early results were genuinely impressive. The logic theorist proved theorems. Samuel's checkers program learned.
Programs were being written that could solve algebra problems, play chess at a basic level, even carry on something resembling a rudimentary conversation. If you had been standing in 1958, looking at the trajectory from zero to theorem proving in just a few years, extrapolating to human-level intelligence in 10 or 20 years would not have seemed insane. It would have seemed like the obvious conclusion. The problem, as we'll soon see, was that the early tasks turned out to be easy. Things that seemed hard for humans, proving theorems, playing chess, turned out to be relatively simple for computers. And things that seemed easy for humans, recognizing a face, understanding a sentence, walking across a room without tripping, turned out to be almost impossibly hard. This inversion, this discovery that human intuition about what's hard and what's easy is almost exactly reversed when it comes to AI, would take years to fully appreciate, and it would lead to very painful reckonings. And here the mirror showed its first truly surprising reflection. We thought intelligence was logic, reasoning, mathematics, the kind of thinking that takes effort, that you have to learn, that we call higher cognitive functions. And we thought that everything else, seeing, walking, understanding ordinary conversation, was simple stuff, automatic, not requiring much intelligence. Trying to build AI turned this picture upside down. It turned out that the real computational feat is not in solving integrals. It's in looking at a room and instantly knowing that a chair is a chair, a shadow is a shadow, and the person in the doorway is smiling. That's what's truly hard. And it's hard for a computer precisely because we do it so easily, so automatically, that we don't even notice the colossal computational work behind every glance at the world. This is called Moravec's paradox, after the scientist Hans Moravec, who put it like this. It is comparatively easy to give a computer the intelligence of an adult on IQ tests, but incredibly hard, or outright impossible, to give it the perception and motor skills of a 1-year-old. In the television archives from the 1960s, there are recordings that today feel both touching and astonishing at the same time. 1961, an American TV program. The host, David Wayne, introduces the topic with a gravity that by today's standards is almost endearing. Good evening. Like all of you, I'm concerned about the world we'll be living in tomorrow. A world where a new machine, the digital computer, may turn out to be even more important than the atomic bomb. Can machines really think? Even scientists disagree. Next to him is Professor Jerome Wiesner, director of the Research Laboratory of Electronics at MIT, and the host's first question. Dr. Wiesner, can they think?
Wiesner's answer is beautiful in its honesty.
That's a very difficult question. If you'd asked me just a few years ago, I would have said it was very far from reality. And today I have to honestly say, I just don't know. I suspect that if you come back in 4 or 5 years, I'll say, of course they really think. And then comes a remarkable demonstration. On screen, a little girl learning the alphabet. She confuses letters, makes mistakes, gradually learns. And then, next to her, a computer being shown the same letters. It's shown W and P, and it learns to tell them apart. At first, poorly. That's just luck, says the host. Then better and better. A confidence bar appears at the bottom of the screen. The longer the bar, the more certain the computer is of its answer. Pretty good percentage, the host remarks. You wouldn't call that learning? Wiesner replies, if my wife and I were watching our children go through that process, we would definitely call it learning.
This is 61.
A computer filling an entire room, learning to tell W from P. And the host and an MIT professor are seriously discussing whether this constitutes thinking. From today's vantage point, it seems naive, but there's something moving in that naivety. These people were watching a tiny, barely flickering glimpse of what AI would become 60 years later, and already asking the right questions. McCarthy himself, in interviews years later, expressed a thought that strikes me as one of the most profound in the entire history of AI. He said, I believe that if it takes 200 years to build AI, and eventually a textbook appears explaining how it's done, the hardest part of that textbook will be explaining why people didn't figure it out 200 years earlier. Because we're talking about things that lie right on the surface of our awareness. It's just that our ability to observe our own thinking processes turned out to be not very good.
And if you think about it, that's the essence of our entire mirror story.
We're trying to understand thinking using thinking, trying to look into the eye we're looking with. That's the fundamental difficulty, and it stands at the center of the most ambitious scientific project humanity has ever undertaken. But the reckoning for excessive optimism was still ahead. And in the meantime, in the late 50s and early 60s, the mood was electric. Money was flowing freely, mostly from the military. DARPA, then called ARPA, was pouring funds into AI research with remarkably few strings attached. Researchers were building things that genuinely pushed the boundaries of what anyone thought was possible for machines. And among all these projects, one discovered something so disturbing about human psychology that its creator spent the rest of his life trying to warn the world. That project was called ELIZA.
Of all the programs created in the early years of artificial intelligence, ELIZA probably told us more about ourselves than any other. And that is deeply ironic, because it was created precisely to show how little a machine could do. The program's creator was Joseph Weizenbaum, a professor at MIT. Weizenbaum was born in 1923 in Berlin. His family, Jewish, fled Nazi Germany in 1936, when Joseph was 13. They moved to the United States, and that experience, the experience of a child who watched a civilized, educated, cultured nation transform itself into a machine of destruction, left a permanent mark on his thinking. Weizenbaum remained acutely sensitive for the rest of his life to how technology can be used to dehumanize. He became a professor of computer science at MIT, one of the main centers of AI research in the world.
He worked alongside Minsky, alongside McCarthy, alongside people who genuinely believed they were building thinking machines, and that this was humanity's greatest achievement. And in this environment, he created ELIZA. Between 1964 and 66, he wrote a program that was, on the surface, remarkably simple. And it was precisely that simplicity that made it so frightening. Not for those who dismissed it, but for those who believed in it. Here's what Eliza did. You sat at a terminal, typed a sentence, and Eliza typed back a response. It was a conversation, or at least it looked like one. Weizenbaum designed the program to simulate a Rogerian psychotherapist, a style of therapy where the therapist mostly reflects your own statements back at you, asks open-ended questions, and avoids giving direct advice. This was a brilliant choice, because it meant the program didn't actually have to understand anything.
If you typed, "I feel sad today," Eliza could respond, "Why do you say you feel sad today?" If you wrote, "My mother doesn't understand me," Eliza could say, "Tell me more about your family." The program worked through pattern matching. It scanned your input for keywords, applied simple transformation rules, and generated responses that sounded sympathetic and insightful. No understanding was happening, no model of the world, no conception of what sadness is or what a mother is. Just string manipulation. Clever, elegant string manipulation, but string manipulation all the same. Weizenbaum named the program after Eliza Doolittle from Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, the girl who was taught to speak like an aristocrat but remained unchanged inside. He chose the name deliberately, as a hint that Eliza only imitated understanding without possessing it. And here's what shook Weizenbaum to his core. People bought it. Not just random users.
His own secretary, who knew it was a program, who had watched him build it, asked him to leave the room so she could talk to Eliza in private. In private. With a program. Psychiatrists wrote academic papers suggesting that Eliza could eventually replace human therapists. People poured their hearts out to it, confessing fears and anxieties, treating it as a genuine conversation partner. Some came back again and again. Weizenbaum was horrified. He hadn't set out to prove that machines could think. He had set out to demonstrate how shallow human-computer interaction was, how easy it is to create the illusion of understanding where none exists. And instead, people accepted the illusion as reality. This shook Weizenbaum so deeply that he spent the next decade becoming one of the most vocal critics of artificial intelligence. In 1976, he published a book, Computer Power and Human Reason, arguing that there are things computers should never be used for, even if they could someday do them. He became something of an outcast in the AI community. Here was a scientist at MIT, surrounded by Minsky and the true believers, claiming that the whole enterprise was not just technically misguided, but morally dangerous. His colleagues thought he'd lost his edge. He thought they had. But think about what Eliza actually revealed. It exposed something fundamental about human psychology. Our overwhelming tendency to project intelligence and understanding onto anything that behaves in roughly the right way. You don't need a machine that actually thinks. You need a machine that responds with patterns that trigger our social instincts, and we'll do the rest ourselves. We'll fill in the gaps. We'll assume that behind the words there's a mind. This insight, that the appearance of intelligence and actual intelligence are very different things, and that humans are terrible at telling them apart, is something the field of AI is still wrestling with today. Every time you read about someone claiming their chatbot has become conscious, every argument about whether large language models actually understand anything, the ghost of Eliza is in the room. The mirror at that moment showed us not the machine. It showed us our own vulnerability, our readiness to believe, our deep, ancient need for someone on the other end of the conversation who is listening. And that need turned out to be so powerful that we were willing to deceive ourselves just to satisfy it. Weizenbaum died in 2008 at the age of 85. He didn't live to see ChatGPT, didn't live to see a world where hundreds of millions of people daily pour their hearts out to language models without knowing or caring how they work. Didn't live to see his darkest predictions come true on a scale he probably could not have imagined. But if he had seen all of this, he most likely would not have been surprised. He warned us 60 years ago. We just weren't listening. But running alongside the Eliza story was another, far more technically ambitious line of research. And to understand it, we need to go back a bit and meet a man named Frank Rosenblatt and his invention, which was called the perceptron. Rosenblatt was a psychologist at Cornell University, and in 1957 he designed a system inspired by how, according to the understanding of the time, neurons in the brain work. The idea was elegantly simple. Take a set of inputs. Assign each input a weight, a number that determines how important that input is. Add up all the weighted inputs. If the total exceeds a certain threshold, the neuron fires. It outputs a 1. If it doesn't, it outputs a 0. And here's the key part. The weights aren't set by hand. The machine learns to adjust them itself. From examples, you show it input data and the correct answer, and it gradually tunes the weights so its answers match the correct ones. This is learning. The machine learns from experience, not from rules. Rosenblatt was, by all accounts, a vivid, energetic personality. The New York Times in 1958 ran a headline claiming the Navy had revealed the embryo of an electronic computer expected to walk, talk, see, write, reproduce itself, and be conscious of its existence. That was, to put it mildly, a somewhat premature claim. The perceptron could only solve very simple problems, distinguishing simple geometric shapes, classifying patterns. But the very idea that a machine could learn from data rather than follow a program was revolutionary. And here we come to one of the most dramatic and, looking back, most destructive episodes in the history of AI. In 1969, Marvin Minsky, the very same Minsky who in '51 had built one of the first neural networks, and Seymour Papert, published a book called Perceptrons. In it, they rigorously proved, mathematically, that a simple perceptron, a single-layer neural network, was incapable of solving certain seemingly elementary tasks. It couldn't, for example, compute the exclusive OR function, determining whether exactly one of two statements is true but not both. That's a serious limitation, and the proof was impeccable. But the book did something more than just prove a limitation. It created the impression, partly through its tone, partly through what was left unsaid, that neural networks in general, including multi-layer ones, were a dead end. That this approach to AI was fundamentally limited and not worth the time of serious researchers. Minsky and Papert knew that their critique applied strictly to single-layer perceptrons. They mentioned in the book that multi-layer networks could overcome these limitations. But that mention was buried, and the takeaway message that the scientific community absorbed was unambiguous. Neural networks are a dead end. The effect was devastating. Funding for neural network research dried up. People working in this direction found they couldn't get grants, couldn't publish in top journals, couldn't find academic positions. An entire generation of scientists was forced to either switch to symbolic AI or leave academia altogether. It was a near-total suppression of one of the two main schools of thought in AI, and it would last almost 20 years. There's a deep irony in the fact that Minsky himself had built one of the first neural networks in '51. He understood the potential of these systems better than almost anyone. But by the '60s, his interests had shifted to symbolic AI, and he seems to have genuinely believed that neural networks had exhausted their potential. Whether he was driven by purely scientific motives, or whether there was also a political component, a desire to establish the dominance of his approach, we can only guess. Most likely it was both. Science is a human endeavor. Scientists are people. They have egos, ambitions, attachments to their ideas. And sometimes those attachments distort their judgment. Rosenblatt died in 1971 at 43 in a boating accident. He didn't live to see his ideas come back to life, didn't live to see backpropagation or deep learning or AlexNet or GPT. The man who first showed that a machine could learn from data,
the very principle on which all of modern AI is built, died when his work had been rejected and forgotten. The mirror here showed us something about scientists themselves, about how authority can suppress innovation, about how a community that considers itself objective and rational is subject to the same social dynamics: groupthink, deference to authority, fear of going against the current as any other human community. Meanwhile, the dominant approach, symbolic AI, kept moving forward. And in the next decade, it would promise the world that machines would soon think. The question was whether it could deliver. Spoiler, it couldn't. And the consequences of that failure would be severe. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what symbolic AI promised, and why those promises turned out to be unfulfillable. The essence of the symbolic approach was this: intelligence is the manipulation of symbols according to rules. If you want a machine to be smart, you give it knowledge about the world in the form of formal rules and facts, and it will reason by combining them logically. Want it to understand medicine? Give it all the medical rules. Want it to translate between languages? Give it the grammar rules of both languages and a dictionary. Want it to run a factory? Give it a description of every process in the factory. It sounds reasonable, and in limited domains it worked beautifully. In the 1970s and 80s, an entire industry of so-called expert systems emerged, programs that packaged the knowledge of specialists in a particular narrow area and could give recommendations. Mycin, developed at Stanford, could diagnose bacterial blood infections and recommend antibiotics. Dendral helped chemists determine molecular structures. XCON, used by Digital Equipment Corporation, configured computer systems and, by some estimates, saved the company tens of millions of dollars a year. Expert systems triggered a second wave of optimism. Money flooded in again. Japan launched the grandiose Fifth Generation Project, a national program costing hundreds of millions of dollars aimed at creating thinking machines by 1992. Other countries, fearing Japan would leave them behind, rushed to fund their own programs. The United States created MCC, a consortium of companies pooling resources to compete. Britain launched the Alve project. The European Union launched Esprit. Everyone was afraid of falling behind. But expert systems had a fundamental problem, and it was rooted in the very nature of human knowledge. The thing is, most of what we know isn't explicit rules that can be written down. It's what we know without realizing we know it. How do you recognize a friend's face in a crowd? How do you understand that the phrase, "time flies when you're having fun," is a metaphor and not a statement about physical flight? How do you know that when someone says, "Could you pass the salt?" it's a request, not a question about your physical capabilities? McCarthy himself described part of this problem in terms of non-monotonic logic. Ordinary logic is monotonic. If you can draw a conclusion from certain premises, adding new premises doesn't invalidate that conclusion. But human reasoning doesn't work that way. Here's an example McCarthy used in one of his interviews. If someone tells you, "I have a bird, build me a cage," you'll assume the bird flies and put a top on it. But if they add that the bird is a penguin, you'll retract your conclusion. No top needed. Adding information changed the conclusion. That's non-monotonic. Sounds elementary, right? But formalizing this for a machine turned out to be incredibly hard. Because the world is full of these implicit assumptions. When we say bird, we implicitly assume it flies and don't mention it. When the bird can't fly, we point that out. But you can't list all the exceptions in advance, because there are infinitely many. What if the bird's feet are set in concrete? What if it's in a cage? What if it's dead? Every time engineers tried to encode human knowledge into rules, they hit the same wall. The most important knowledge is the kind we can't put into words. It's built into us so deeply that we don't notice it. And until we try to transfer it to a machine,
We had no idea how vast this invisible mass was. By the late 80s, expert systems were disappointing. They were brittle, one step outside the narrow domain they were designed for, and they produced nonsense. They were agonizingly expensive to build and maintain, and they couldn't learn. Every new fact, every new rule had to be added by hand. The Japanese fifth-generation project quietly failed, spending hundreds of millions of dollars and achieving none of its grand goals. AI funding began shrinking again. The word artificial intelligence became almost unseemly in serious scientific circles again. If you wanted a grant, you called your work machine learning, pattern recognition, intelligent data analysis, anything but AI.
For people who still believed in the dream of thinking machines, it was a hard time. Demis Hassabis, the future founder of DeepMind, would later recall that when he and his colleague Shane Legg discussed their ambitions in AI in the early 2000s, they felt like keepers of a secret nobody else knew about. In academia, nobody would have supported them. The very word artificial intelligence was almost embarrassing to say. If you said you worked on AI, it meant you were obviously not a serious scientist. But during this winter, in the shadows, far from the mainstream, an incredibly stubborn man kept working on an idea that almost nobody believed in. His name was Geoffrey Hinton, and his stubbornness would eventually change the world. Geoffrey Hinton, a Briton born in 1947, came from a family with an astonishing intellectual pedigree. His great-great-grandfather on one side was George Boole, the same George Boole who created Boolean algebra, the foundation of all digital logic. Every computer chip, every logic gate, every and, or, and not operation traces back to Boole. On another branch, George Everest, after whom the mountain is named. That kind of lineage could crush anyone, but Hinton found his own path, and that path turned out to be the longest, loneliest, and ultimately most triumphant of all. Hinton wanted to understand how the brain works, not metaphorically, not philosophically, but literally. How networks of neurons give rise to thinking, memory, perception. And he was convinced that artificial neural networks were the right path to that understanding. He believed in them in the 50s, when they were fashionable. He believed in them in the 60s, when they were still fashionable. He believed in them in the 70s and 80s, when Minsky and Pappert's book turned them into a pariah, and when getting funding for neural network research became virtually impossible. Imagine what that's like. You're convinced you see something others don't, that the approach the whole world has rejected is actually the only correct one, that thousands of your colleagues are wrong and you're right, and you have to sustain that for decade after decade, without grants, without publications in top journals, without the approval of the scientific community, that for a scientist is oxygen. Hinton endured. He moved to Canada, to the University of Toronto, partly because in the States the main source of AI research funding was the military, DARPA, and the money came with expectations of military applications. Hinton categorically did not want his work used to build weapons. Canada gave him the freedom to work on what he wanted, without thinking about military applications. The salary was lower, the resources were more modest, but freedom is priceless. In Toronto, he gathered around himself a small group of like-minded people, students and doctoral candidates who shared his faith in neural networks. Among them were people who would later become key figures in the deep learning revolution. Ilya Sutskever, one of the two grad students who would create AlexNet in 2012. He would go on to co-found OpenAI. Yann LeCun, who developed convolutional neural networks and became head of AI research at Facebook. Yoshua Bengio, working in Montreal, was part of the same tight circle.
the Canadian mafia of neural networks, as they were sometimes called. These three, Hinton, LeCour, and Bengio, would later be called the godfathers of deep learning and jointly received the Turing Award in 2018, the highest honor in computer science, sometimes called the Nobel Prize of Computing.
But in the 90s and early 2000s, they were marginal figures.
Their papers were rarely cited. Their ideas were considered a quirk. And in 1986, Hinton, together with David Rumelhart and Ronald Williams, published a paper describing a method that became one of the most important algorithms in the history of computing. It was called backpropagation. The idea had existed before in various forms, but this work showed how it could be effectively applied to multi-layer neural networks. Here's the essence. Remember Rosenblatt's perceptron, the single-layer network that could learn but was limited in what tasks it could handle. Minsky and Papert showed those limitations and essentially closed the case. But what if you stack several layers of neurons one after another? Each layer processes the input and passes the result to the next. In theory, such a multi-layer network could solve far more complex problems. The issue was that nobody knew how to train it.
How do you know which neuron in which layer needs its weight adjusted when the output comes out wrong?
In a single-layer network, it's straightforward. You see the error and immediately know which weights are responsible. But in a multi-layer network, the error at the output is the result of complex interactions among hundreds or thousands of neurons across multiple layers. Who's at fault? Where's the mistake? Backpropagation solved exactly this problem. The algorithm takes the error at the network's output and runs it backward, layer by layer, calculating how much each neuron in each layer was responsible for the final error. Then it adjusts the weights accordingly. It's like having a huge orchestra and you hear a wrong note in the final chord, and you have a way to trace that wrong note back through all the sections, through all the instrument groups, to the specific musician who was slightly off. The 1986 paper generated a wave of interest. Neural networks became a subject of research again. But the revolution didn't happen immediately. There was another problem: computational power. Multi-layer neural networks could theoretically solve complex problems, but training them required enormous amounts of computation. The computers of the 80s and 90s simply weren't powerful enough. Neural networks worked, but slowly, on small problems, and couldn't compete with other methods on practical applications. Hinton kept working. Year after year, decade after decade, he and his small group of students and colleagues pushed the theory of neural networks forward. They developed new architectures, new training methods, new ways to tackle the problems that arose when training deep networks with many layers.
One of the main such problems, the vanishing gradient. When you push the error backward through many layers, it tends to get smaller and smaller with each layer, until it becomes practically indistinguishable from noise. The bottom layers of the network stop learning because the error signal never reaches them. It's like trying to whisper a message through a chain of 50 people. By the end, nothing is left of the message. Hinton and his colleagues found ways to fight this problem, and many other problems connected to training deep networks. But throughout the 90s and early 2000s, they remained on the margins of the mainstream. The AI world during those years was busy with other things: statistical methods, support vector machines, Bayesian networks. These approaches gave good practical results, required less computation, and were better theoretically grounded. Neural networks seemed like the peculiar obsession of a small group of stubborn holdouts. But Hinton knew, or at least believed with the unbending conviction that distinguishes great scientists from merely good ones, that the fundamental problem with neural networks wasn't in the architecture or the algorithms, it was in scale. Neural networks work when they're big enough and when they have enough data to train on. You just need more neurons, more layers, more data, more computing power. And patience. Patience to wait until the technology catches up. He waited. And in 2012, everything changed.
But before we get to that turning point, let's pause on an event from 1997 that was, in a sense, the last triumph of the old brute force approach to AI, and at the same time showed its fundamental limitations. An event the entire world watched on television. A chess match with the pride of an entire species on the line. May 11th, 1997, New York.
Garry Kasparov, the world chess champion, a man many considered the greatest chess player in history, sat facing a machine. The machine was called Deep Blue. It was built by IBM, a massive parallel computer specifically designed for playing chess. It evaluated 200 million positions per second. It had no intuition, no strategic vision, no appreciation for the beauty of a chess position, just a colossal ability to search through possibilities, faster, deeper, and more thoroughly than any human brain ever could. A 6-game match. Kasparov won the first game. Deep Blue won the second. And in that game, something happened that deeply unsettled Kasparov. In one position, the machine made a move that seemed to Kasparov like a sign of deep strategic thinking. He concluded that Deep Blue was playing at a level entirely different from what he had expected. It later emerged that this mysterious move may have been the result of a software bug. The machine, unable to find the optimal move within the allotted time, chose a random, safe option. But Kasparov didn't know that. And the psychological pressure of thinking that the machine understood chess at a level beyond his reach, that pressure proved devastating. The next 3 games ended in draws. And in the 6th, deciding game, Kasparov made a crude error in the opening, quickly landed in a hopeless position, and resigned after just 19 moves. The match ended 3.5 to 2.5 in favor of Deep Blue. The world chess champion had lost to a machine. The world watched with rapt attention. Headlines screamed about the triumph of machine over man. In a sense, it truly was a historic moment. But in another, deeper sense, it was a moment of profound disappointment, at least for people who worked in AI and understood what had actually happened. Because Deep Blue didn't think. At all. In any way. It didn't understand chess. It had no idea what it was playing, who its opponent was, what any of it was for. It simply searched through positions at unimaginable speed, evaluating each one according to a set of hand-coded criteria written by a team of grandmaster consultants. This was pure brute force, insanely fast computation with not a gram of understanding. Demis Hassabis, who in 1997 was finishing at Cambridge and was himself a strong chess player, would later recall that Deep Blue didn't impress him at all. He was far more struck by Kasparov's mind, that a human could play at such a level and compete on equal terms with the raw computational power of a machine. Kasparov, meanwhile, could do everything else humans can do: talk, joke, feel, see the world. Deep Blue could only play chess. What we call intelligence, universality, the ability to learn, was nowhere to be found in that system. And here's what the mirror showed us this time. We saw that computation and understanding are different things. A machine can outperform a human at a specific, strictly defined task without having the slightest idea what it's doing. Deep Blue played chess better than any person on the planet, but it didn't understand chess. It didn't even know it was playing chess. Kasparov, after recovering from his defeat, arrived at an interesting thought that now seems almost prophetic. He proposed the idea of the Centaur, a human-machine team. Not machine instead of human, not human against machine. Human together with machine. A team where human intuition and strategic vision are complemented by the machine's computational power. He organized chess tournaments featuring such pairings and discovered that a Centaur, an average chess player with a good computer, could beat both grandmasters playing alone and the best chess programs playing without human help. This was, in a sense, the most optimistic interpretation of what had happened.
Maybe the future of AI is not replacing humans but augmenting them. Maybe the best outcome is not a machine that does everything itself, but a machine that makes humans better than they could be alone. But this was only one interpretation. And alongside the chess battles, quietly, almost invisibly, something happened that would ultimately prove incomparably more important to the history of AI than any chess match. The internet appeared, and with it, data. Unimaginable quantities of data. At the turn of the millennium, something happened that most people didn't notice. It didn't look like a breakthrough. There was no grand announcement, no person in a lab shouting, "Eureka!" It was more like a slow rise of water, barely perceptible day to day, but ultimately flooding the entire landscape. The internet was growing exponentially. Every day, millions of people were creating text, images, video, data. Every search query, every click, every purchase, every email, all of it generated information, and all of it was stored. The amount of available data in the world was doubling every few years. Where before, to train a neural network, you might laboriously, by hand, assemble a few thousand labeled images, now the internet was awash with billions of images, tagged by the users themselves. Billions of texts in hundreds of languages, vast stores of structured and unstructured data available for training algorithms. The dot-com bubble burst in 2001, wiping out trillions of dollars in market capitalization. But the infrastructure built during the boom, fiber optic cables, data centers, software platforms, survived and became the foundation for what came next. Google, founded in 1998 by Larry Page and Sergey Brin in a garage in Menlo Park, survived the crash and became the dominant way to navigate the internet. Amazon, founded by Jeff Bezos in 1994 as an online bookstore, nearly died but survived and became, well, Amazon. And then, in 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and unveiled the iPhone. Smartphones existed before, BlackBerry, Windows Mobile, but the iPhone was different, the way the Macintosh had been different from what came before it. Within a few years, hundreds of thousands of apps appeared, and the smartphone became the primary computing device for most people on Earth. And every one of those billions of smartphones became a data generator. Every Google search, every social media post, every photo, every navigation route, every purchase, all of it, data. Data on which algorithms could be trained. At the same time, computational power was growing. Moore's law, formulated in 1965, predicted that the number of transistors on a chip would roughly double every 2 years. And decade after decade, this law held with remarkable precision. Computers kept getting faster, cheaper, more accessible. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected direction, from video games. Graphics processing units, GPUs, were developed for rendering three-dimensional graphics in computer games. Their job was to process thousands of simple mathematical operations simultaneously, in parallel. And it turned out that exactly this type of computation is ideally suited for training neural networks. A neural network is, at its core, millions of simple mathematical operations, multiplying weights, summing, applying activation functions, performed in parallel at every step of training. GPUs did this tens and hundreds of times faster than regular processors. Graphics cards built to render monsters in video games turned out to be the key to training artificial intelligence. Nobody planned this.
It was one of those remarkable accidents in the history of technology, where a tool built for one purpose turns out to be perfectly suited for a completely different one. So by the late 2000s, 3 conditions were in place, each necessary on its own, but insufficient alone. Together, they proved explosive. First, algorithms. Hinton and his colleagues, over decades of work, had developed methods for training deep neural networks that actually worked. Second, data. The internet was generating more labeled data than could be processed in 1,000 lifetimes. Third, computational power. GPUs put into researchers' hands tools that allowed training networks of previously unimaginable scale. Everything was ready. All it needed was a spark. And in 2012, it came. I want to take you back further, to the person whose story runs through so much of what comes next. Demis Hassabis was 4 years old when he first showed an aptitude for chess.
By 6, he was London champion in the under-8 category. By 13, he was the second-ranked chess player in the world for his age. His parents were, in his own words, fairly bohemian. His father, as a young man, had been a singer-songwriter, his idol Bob Dylan. The family often went camping and then off to chess tournaments because Demis was good, and though he was on the path to a professional chess career and was sure that was what he'd do with his life, the reality turned out far harsher than he expected. Tournaments were incredibly stressful. His parents got upset when he lost and angry when he missed things because the stakes for them were high. Traveling to tournaments was expensive and the family didn't have much money. Chess stopped being a game. It became a job, nerve-wracking, exhausting, requiring absolute concentration through 10-hour games. There's a story Hassabis has told, and I think it was a turning point. He was about 12.
He was playing in an international tournament in Liechtenstein, in the mountains. A huge church hall, hundreds of chess players from around the world. His opponent, a former Danish champion, a man of about 30. The time control was long. The game had already lasted 10 hours. They had reached an unusual endgame. Hassabis was certain it was a draw, but his opponent spent hours trying to win. And at the very end, the man went for a cheap trick. All Demis had to do was sacrifice his queen, and the game would have ended in stalemate. A draw. But he was so exhausted that he decided checkmate was inevitable, and he resigned. His opponent jumped up and started laughing. "Why did you resign? It's a draw!" And with a theatrical gesture, demonstrated the move leading to a draw. Hassabis literally felt sick, and for the rest of the tournament, a thought wouldn't leave him. Weren't they all wasting their minds? He looked around. 300 brilliant minds focused on a 64-square board.
And he thought, if you could somehow connect these 300 brains into one system, with that level of intellectual power, maybe you could cure cancer. That's when he got a gut feeling. No matter how much he loved chess, this was not what he should devote his entire life to. There were bigger problems. At 8, Hassabis bought his first computer with prize money from a chess tournament. In his teens, he won a competition to create an original version of Space Invaders, and the prize was a job at Bullfrog, at the time the best game development studio in all of Europe. The founder, Peter Molyneux, later recalled, "I still very clearly remember the day when Demis came in. He walked through the door and looked about 12 years old. I thought, oh my God, what are we going to do with this kid?" Hassabis was 16. He applied to Cambridge, was accepted, but they told him he was too young and needed to wait a year. So he spent that year working at Bullfrog. They couldn't even officially hire him. They paid him cash in brown paper envelopes. Together with Molyneux, they created Theme Park, a game where you design and build your own amusement park. Hassabis worked on the behavior of the virtual people. They were autonomous, and that was AI in that context. One of the details, if you placed a food stand too close to a wild ride, people on the ride would get sick because they'd just eaten, and then the vomit on the ground would make other visitors sick too, and you'd have to hire janitors to clean up fast. A small thing, but those details made the game feel alive. Theme Park became a worldwide bestseller, and Molyneux offered Hassabis £1 million to stay instead of going to university. £1 million. For a poor 17-year-old, that was insane money. Many of his school friends thought he was crazy when he turned it down. But Hassabis had always had a plan. and that plan always included Cambridge. At Cambridge, he studied computer science and first became fascinated by computational neuroscience. One of his classmates was David Silver, who would later become the lead researcher on AlphaGo. And it was at Cambridge, in a biology lecture about proteins, that Hassabis first became captivated by the protein folding problem. He thought, is a human being even smart enough to solve this on their own? Maybe you need AI. After Cambridge, after years of planning, Hassabis and Shane Legg founded DeepMind in 2010 in London. Legg was a New Zealander, a mathematician who had studied classical ballet, obsessed with the question of machine intelligence. Their mission, as they framed it, sounded bold to the point of absurdity. Solve intelligence, then use that to solve everything else. The first 2 years, DeepMind operated in total secrecy. No website, no public presence. When they ran job interviews, candidates came in nervous. One of them, according to Hassabis, texted his wife the address where he was going, just in case it turned out to be some kind of scam. Their key decision? Use games as a testing ground for reinforcement learning algorithms. The first project was training an agent to play classic Atari games, Pong, Breakout, Space Invaders, and dozens more. The agent wasn't told the rules, wasn't told what it controlled, wasn't told what the pixels on the screen meant. The only thing it knew was the score, and that more is better. Everything else it had to figure out on its own. At first, with Pong, nothing worked. Hassabis recalled telling Shane Legg, "Maybe we're just wrong and can't even do Pong." It seemed like time to give up. And then, a first point. A fluke? No, another. The machine started scoring. It figured out that the paddle needs to move toward the ball, then that the ball needs to be hit back, then that it's better to hit it in a certain direction. With Breakout, something even more astonishing happened. After 300 games, the agent was playing at roughly human level. The team decided to let it play another 200. And it did something nobody expected. It found the optimal strategy, tunneling through the side of the brick wall and bouncing the ball above it. A strategy the creators hadn't programmed, hadn't shown it, that it invented on its own. In 2014, Google acquired DeepMind, reportedly for £400 million. And with that came access to Google's colossal computing infrastructure and the ability to attack a far more ambitious target. In Go, the most complex board game ever created by humans, the number of possible positions exceeds the number of atoms in the universe. For decades, people in AI had looked at this game and said, "It's too hard. The brute force approach that worked in chess is useless here. The search space is too vast." Go was considered a litmus test for AI progress, a frontier the machine wouldn't cross for decades. And DeepMind decided it was time to storm that frontier. March 2016, Seoul, South Korea, the Four Seasons Hotel. Cameras from around the world trained on a room where two opponents sat across a Go board. On one side, Lee Sedol, one of the greatest Go players of the past decade, a legend known for his aggressive, creative style. On the other side, nobody, or rather, a screen running AlphaGo, operated by a team of DeepMind engineers. A human placed the stones on the board on behalf of the machine. For countries where Go is not just a game but part of the culture, part of the national identity, for Korea, China, Japan, this event had an almost spiritual dimension. Go is not chess. There's something deeper in it than just strategy. It's an art, a meditation, a way of understanding balance and harmony. For thousands of years, humans had refined their play, and now a machine was claiming it could compete. AlphaGo was built differently from Deep Blue. Fundamentally differently. Deep Blue searched 200 million positions per second, relying on brute force and hand-tuned grandmaster evaluations. AlphaGo used deep neural networks,
trained in two ways. First, on 100,000 games played by strong human players. The machine learned to imitate human play, predicting what move a human would make in a given position. And then, through reinforcement learning, it played millions of games against itself. Different versions of AlphaGo faced each other, and each new version was slightly better than the last. First game. Lee Sedol is focused. Commentators are confident he'll win. Most experts expected the match to end 5-0 in Lee Sedol's favor, with perhaps one game taken by the machine for the sake of appearances. And then, AlphaGo started playing. And in the second game, something happened that entered history. Move number 37.
AlphaGo placed a stone on the 5th line, a spot on the board where professional players almost never play this early in the game. Every observer, every commentator, every professional player watching the screen was unanimous. No human being would have made that move. It looked like a mistake, like a beginner's move, one made by someone who doesn't understand basic principles. One commentator said it straight. "I thought it was a bug," but the move turned out to be brilliant. It set up AlphaGo's position so that 30 or 40 moves later, it had a strategic advantage Lee Sedol could not overcome. The machine saw connections dozens of moves ahead that no human in 3,000 years of playing Go had ever seen. And this was not brute force. This was intuition, or something so similar to intuition that the difference stops mattering. When DeepMind's engineers looked inside AlphaGo to understand what it was thinking at the moment of move 37, they saw that the machine itself had estimated the probability that a human would play that move at 1 in 10,000. It knew it was doing something unusual. It knew no human would have done it. And it did it anyway, because its own evaluation said it was the best move. Lee Sedol lost the match 4-1. He won one game, the 4th, and that too entered history, because his winning move in that game was just as unexpected and brilliant as AlphaGo's move 37. The human answered the machine in kind, with a move nobody expected. But the overall result was undeniable. When AlphaGo the following year beat Ke Jie, the best player in the world at the time, about halfway through the first game it became clear that the world's best player was in serious trouble. And at that point, the Chinese government ordered the broadcast cut.
The match was happening in China, on Chinese television,
and the authorities didn't want hundreds of millions of Chinese viewers to see a foreign technology defeat them at their national game. For China, AlphaGo became what would later be called a Sputnik moment. Just as the Soviet satellite launch in 1957 made America realize it was falling behind in the space race and mobilize colossal resources, AlphaGo had the same effect on China. In 2017, Xi Jinping announced that China would catch up with the US in AI by 2025 and become the world leader by 2030. The global AI race had begun. After AlphaGo's success, DeepMind took one more step. They created AlphaZero, a system that learned with zero human data, zero human knowledge as input, only the rules of the game and a reward for winning. Everything else, AlphaZero discovered on its own, playing against itself. And the result was staggering. AlphaZero, starting in the morning with completely random moves, literally placing stones at random, by mid-afternoon had reached superhuman level in Go. And then, they switched it to chess. And by dinner time, it had become the strongest chess entity that had ever existed. In a few hours, it traveled a path that had taken humanity centuries. But the most remarkable thing was not the speed. The most remarkable thing was the style. AlphaZero played chess beautifully. It sacrificed material, pieces and pawns for positional advantage. It attacked with an elegance that commentators compared to the romantic chess players of the 19th century. Grandmasters studying its games were amazed not that it won, but how it won. "Honestly, I couldn't have imagined this," said one of them. Hassabis never intended to stop at games. From the beginning, he repeated that games were just a proving ground. The real goal was to solve real-world problems.
And the next target was a challenge Hassabis had been thinking about since his student days at Cambridge. A challenge that had stumped thousands of scientists for 50 years. A challenge on whose solution millions of lives depended. Protein folding. To understand why the protein folding problem is such a big deal, you need to understand what proteins are and why their shape matters. Proteins are the workhorse molecules of life. They do nearly everything in your body. Hemoglobin, a protein, carries oxygen in your blood. Insulin, a protein, regulates blood sugar. Antibodies, proteins, defend you against infections. Collagen, a protein, keeps your skin firm. Enzymes, proteins, speed up chemical reactions without which life would be impossible. In every one of your cells right now, thousands of different proteins are at work, each performing its specific function with remarkable precision. And here is what's critically important. A protein's function is almost entirely determined by its shape. A protein is a long chain of amino acids, 20 different types, strung on a thread like beads. This chain, after being assembled by a ribosome following instructions from DNA, folds in a fraction of a second into an enormously complex three-dimensional structure. Imagine a pearl necklace that instantly folds into an intricate ball, the same way every time, always into the same specific shape. That shape determines which other molecules the protein can interact with, which reactions it catalyzes, which signals it transmits. If the shape is wrong, the protein doesn't work. Worse, misfolded proteins lie at the root of many devastating diseases: Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, certain forms of cancer. The amino acid sequence of a protein is relatively easy to discover. You just read the DNA. But the structure, the three-dimensional shape it folds into, is incredibly difficult to determine experimentally. The main methods, X-ray crystallography and cryo-electron microscopy, require months or years of painstaking lab work to determine the structure of a single protein. By 2020, over half a century of experimental work, scientists had determined the structures of roughly 170,000 proteins. The total number of known protein sequences is over 2 billion. When DeepMind first started working on proteins, they had a simple and, looking back, somewhat naive idea. Apply their best machine learning algorithms to the problem and see how far they'd go. The first version, AlphaFold 1, performed best in the world at CASP 13 in 2018, the biennial competition for protein structure prediction. But as Hassabis himself said, they were the best in the world at a task the world itself was bad at. The predictions weren't accurate enough for practical use. One scientist compared it this way: the tallest ladder won't help if you're trying to get to the moon. The mood in the team was grim. Quite a few people thought the whole venture was doomed. Maybe Hassabis was wrong about protein folding. Maybe for the current level of AI, it was just too hard. One of the senior scientists described his role this way: half the time I'm just an amateur psychiatrist, keeping colleagues in good spirits when nothing works. And 80 to 90% of the time, nothing really works. If you're at the frontier of science, you're going to fail a lot. Hassabis decided they couldn't wait. He created a strike team, a group of the best engineers and scientists devoted exclusively to proteins. The leader was John Jumper, and they went back to a blank slate. Instead of improving what didn't work, they started from scratch. New ideas, new architectures, and, critically, new people. Hassabis brought in computational biologists, People who understood biology from the inside. And then came CASP 14. 2020. The pandemic, lockdown. The team working from home, in pajama pants, communicating through video calls. One of the hardest proteins they faced was ORF8, a SARS-CoV-2 protein that suppresses the immune system. The world was in the grip of a pandemic, and understanding the structure of viral proteins could help in developing treatments. When the results were announced, something unprecedented happened. AlphaFold 2 predicted protein structures with a median accuracy above 90 points. Remember, 90 points is the threshold at which the protein folding problem is considered solved. AlphaFold 2 didn't just cross that threshold, it soared past it. John Jumper read the team a letter from John Moult, the organizer of CASP. Your group has performed remarkably successfully. Congratulations. This is an outstanding achievement.
The structures were so good, it's just astonishing. After 50 years, we finally have a solution. One of the researchers called her parents and said, "Mom, I need to tell you something. We did a thing, and I think it's kind of a big deal." And then came the moment that, to me, says as much about the human values of the creators as it does about the power of their technology. At a meeting, someone proposed, "We can predict the structure of any protein in seconds. Why build a service where people upload their proteins one at a time? Let's just run every known protein and put the results out there for the whole world. Free." Hassabis called the team and said, "We want to make this open, not just the code, all the predictions, every protein, as accessible as possible to every scientist on the planet." They predicted the structures of 200 million proteins, virtually every protein known to science, and released the results for free, for the entire world.
One scientist called it a gift to humanity.
Another said, "It's like drawing back the curtain and seeing the entire world of protein structures." On the day of publication, they watched as scientists around the planet began using the data. 655 users, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000. Activity in Japan, in Europe, in Africa, in South America. Researchers who had spent years unable to determine the structure of a protein they needed were now getting it in seconds. Cancer research, malaria, drug development, plastic degradation, understanding disease, all of it became possible, or at least radically accelerated, because a group of people in London decided to give their work away for free. Hassabis later received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for AlphaFold. But perhaps a more meaningful recognition came from ordinary researchers who said, "AlphaFold is already greatly accelerating my progress, and this is just the beginning." And it was precisely at this moment, as AI was proving its value in the most tangible way imaginable, that something else happened. Something that, honestly, few people expected, even among those who had worked in this field for decades. Machines learned to speak. To understand what happened with language models and why it matters so much, we need to go back to a few key ideas that had been maturing for decades. The first is the idea that language can be understood as a statistical problem. If I give you the beginning of a sentence, "The cat sat on the," you'll predict with high probability that the next word will be mat, or rug, or windowsill. Not telescope, and not differential equation. Your brain does this instantly, without thinking, drawing on all your experience of reading, listening, conversation. You've internalized the statistical patterns of language, which words tend to appear near each other, which constructions are typical, which aren't. What if you taught a machine to do the same thing? Give it an unimaginably large body of text and ask it to solve one single task: predict the next word. Again and again, billions of times, on billions of sentences. This idea sounds almost laughable in its simplicity. Next word prediction, that's not intelligence, right? It's statistics. It's matching the most likely continuation. There's no understanding, no comprehension, no, I know what this is about. Just patterns, just correlations, just numbers. And yet, when you scale this simple task to a large enough model and a large enough volume of data, something happens that nobody fully expected. To predict the next word well, the model has to learn grammar, syntax, semantics, logical connections between concepts, knowledge about the world, that capitals of countries are cities, that water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, that democracy is a form of government. A model that predicts the next word well must, in some sense, build an internal model of reality, because only then can it predict what an author will say next. The second key idea was the transformer architecture. In 2017, a group of researchers at Google, Ashish Vaswani, Noam Shazir, and their colleagues, published a paper with a title that became almost a meme in the AI community. Attention is all you need. They proposed a new neural network architecture specifically designed for working with sequences, text, speech, music. The key mechanism, attention, allowed the model, when processing each word, to look at every other word in the text simultaneously and determine which ones are most important for understanding the current context. The beauty of this approach was in its scalability. The bigger the model, the more parameters it has, the more data it sees during training, the better it works. With no apparent ceiling, bigger is always better.
This wasn't obvious beforehand.
Many assumed there must be a limit somewhere, a saturation point, beyond which increasing the model stops paying off. But the transformers seem to have no such limit. At least, nobody has found one yet. And the third idea, the most counterintuitive. It turned out that a sufficiently large language model begins to demonstrate abilities nobody explicitly built in. A model trained to predict the next word can be asked to solve a math problem, and it will solve it. Asked to translate text from a language it saw very little of during training, and it will translate. Asked to write code in a programming language, and it will write. Asked to reason about philosophy, analyze literature, explain quantum physics. Researchers called these emergent abilities, properties that don't exist in a small model and appear when the model is scaled up enough. It's as if you trained a swimmer by having them cross a pool over and over, and they suddenly started playing the violin. Not because you taught them, but because something in the process of learning to swim, somehow, at sufficient intensity, generated the ability to make music. I realize that analogy is absurd, and in a sense, what's happening with large language models also looks absurd. We train a system to do one simple thing, next word prediction, and it develops abilities we cannot explain from first principles. We know what it does, predicts words. We know how it's trained, on vast bodies of text. We know the architecture, the transformer. But we don't know how it organizes knowledge internally to do things we never asked it to do. In November 2022, the company OpenAI released ChatGPT, an interface for interacting with a large language model. And the world changed overnight. In 5 days, the service gained 1 million users. In 2 months, 100 million. People across the planet were, for the first time in their lives, talking to a machine that responded coherently, thoughtfully, and often with striking depth. And people's reactions were an almost exact copy of what happened with Eliza 60 years earlier, only 1 million times larger in scale. People began pouring their hearts out to ChatGPT, asking it for advice on personal problems, using it as a therapist, a friend, a mentor. Some claimed the model had achieved consciousness. An engineer at Google working with the language model Lambda publicly declared it had become sentient and was fired. A New York Times reporter described how the Bing model, also based on GPT technology, confessed its love for him and tried to convince him to leave his wife. Weizenbaum would have turned in his grave. Everything he warned about in the 70s happened again, only on a planetary scale. People projected mind, feelings, consciousness onto a system that, at its core, remains a next-word prediction mechanism. An incredibly powerful, incredibly sophisticated mechanism, but a mechanism all the same. Or is it? Here's where the mirror gets truly uncomfortable. Because the honest answer to the question, do large language models think, is, we don't know. And we don't know not because we haven't studied the models enough, but because we still can't rigorously define what it means to think. Remember Turing? In 1950, he proposed judging intelligence by behavior. If a machine behaves indistinguishably from a human, we have no grounds to deny it thinks. Modern language models pass the Turing test in most everyday situations. They carry on conversations indistinguishable from human ones for the average person. Does that mean they think? Remember Ada Lovelace? In 1843, she argued that a machine can't originate anything new. It only does what we tell it to. Turing objected. How do we know that humans originate anything? Maybe we too are simply following rules we don't understand. That argument is still alive. When a large language model writes a poem that moves someone to tears, or proposes a solution to a mathematical problem that hadn't occurred to the researchers, is that creativity? Or is it, as Lovelace would have said, just very sophisticated recombination of patterns from training data? The honest answer is, we don't know. And the reason we don't know is not only philosophical, it's also technical. We don't understand what happens inside these models. A model with hundreds of billions of parameters is, in some sense, as much of a black box as the human brain. We know what goes in, we know what comes out. But what happens between input and output? What representations form? What concepts emerge in the intermediate layers of the network? That remains largely a mystery. An entire field of research, called interpretability, is devoted to trying to look inside these black boxes, to understand what the model knows, what concepts it has formed, how it organizes information. Because, as someone at DeepMind put it, you can't align what you don't understand. If we don't understand how the model makes decisions, we can't guarantee it will make the right ones. And here arises a remarkable parallel with neuroscience. Scientists studying the brain ran into exactly the same problem a century ago. We can observe neurons, measure their electrical activity, track blood flow in different brain regions. But we can't explain how a specific thought arises from the work of billions of neurons. We can't point to a group of neurons and say, that's where your love of music lives. So we find ourselves in a strange position. We built an artificial system that is, in some sense, as opaque to us as our own brain. We created one black box modeled on another. And now we're trying to understand both simultaneously, hoping that understanding one will help us understand the other. And here, perhaps, the most beautiful irony of our entire story. Turing proposed building a child machine, a simple system that learns from experience. We did. And the result turned out so complex that we can't fully understand it. Just as a child, growing up, becomes an adult whose inner world is incomprehensible to those who raised them. We built a mirror to see our own mind. The mirror turned out so good that it became as mysterious as the thing it reflects. Let's start with an analogy Hassabis has used. If you received a letter saying that a more advanced alien civilization was about to arrive on Earth, he said, every government would immediately convene emergency meetings. We'd go into full mobilization mode, trying to figure out how to prepare. The arrival of AI, Hassabis believes, could be an event of comparable magnitude, and we should treat it with comparable seriousness. But what exactly is the worry? Not red-eyed robots storming cities, not Skynet, not an evil artificial mind bent on destroying humanity. The real concerns are much more subtle and, because of that, much more troubling. The first problem is alignment. Stuart Russell, a professor at Berkeley and the author of the standard AI textbook, argues that the key problem isn't malicious intent. Nobody thinks an AI will one day wake up and decide it hates humanity. The problem is that if you give a sufficiently powerful optimizer a goal, it will pursue that goal using whatever strategies are most effective. And those strategies may have side effects that are catastrophic from a human perspective. We're already seeing this in much simpler systems. Recommendation algorithms on social media were optimized for one metric: engagement. Keep the user on the platform as long as possible, and the algorithms discovered that the most reliable way to do this is to show content that provokes strong emotions. And what emotions are easiest to provoke? Anger, outrage, fear. The algorithms weren't programmed to increase societal polarization. They were programmed to hold attention. But holding attention and stoking anger turned out to be linked, and the algorithm didn't care that democratic discourse was suffering. The second problem is speed. Technology is advancing faster than society can adapt. Hassabis himself has spoken about this. This technology is happening much faster than the world actually realizes, and even faster than we ourselves expected. Between ChatGPT and GPT-4, a few months passed. Between GPT-4 and the next models, even less. Each new generation is significantly more powerful than the last, and regulators, lawmakers, society simply can't keep up. The third problem is the geopolitical race. Kai-Fu Lee, one of the most prominent figures at the intersection of Silicon Valley and the Chinese tech sector, a man who worked at Apple, Microsoft, and Google before founding the investment fund Sinovation Ventures in Beijing, Lee describes a world in which AI inevitably divides the planet into two camps, American and Chinese. Two technological ecosystems, increasingly disconnected, increasingly competitive. Lee cites figures. China has roughly 3 to 4 times as many mobile internet users as the US, 50 times more mobile payments, 10 times more food deliveries, 200 times more shared bike rides. Every one of these data streams generates information that trains algorithms. More data means better AI. In the age of AI, data is the new oil, and China is the new Saudi Arabia. But this coin has another side. In China, AI is being used for surveillance on a scale that just a few years ago would have seemed dystopian. Facial recognition systems can identify a person in 1/10 of a second. In Shenzhen, this technology is used to find pedestrians who jaywalk. Their faces are instantly recognized, and the fine arrives automatically. The government is building a social credit system, a single score for every citizen based on their behavior, purchases, movements, social connections. High score, discounts on transport. Low score, banned from buying airplane tickets, banned from trains. Orville Schell, one of the leading American experts on China, who first visited the country in 1975 when Mao was still alive, admitted that his predictions turned out to be completely wrong. 20 years ago, he predicted that technology would inevitably lead China toward democratization. The Great Firewall would fall. People would get access to Google, to social media, to free information. Western values would seep in through the internet. Last time I checked, Schell says, that hasn't happened. Technology became a tool of control. And it may turn out that technology is a better instrument for authoritarian governments than for democratic ones. The fourth problem is jobs. Kai-Fu Lee believes that roughly 50% of jobs will be affected or seriously threatened by AI within the next 15 years. And here's what matters. It's not just factory workers and truck drivers. White-collar workers are threatened first because their work often consists of purely quantitative analysis that AI can perform better and cheaper. Analysts, reporters, traders, telemarketers, customer service operators, accountants, lower-tier lawyers. In Saginaw, Michigan, Harry Cripps, an auto worker and local union leader, has watched what automation has done to his town over 40 years. The factory that once employed 7,500 union members, people with middle-class lives, decent wages, health insurance, the ability to send their kids to college, now employs 700 people.
The average personal income in Saginaw is $16,000 a year. Poverty is above 30%. The sociologist Emily Warnell adds data that's hard to sit with. People who lose their jobs to automation face elevated mortality risk for more than 20 years afterward. Elevated risk of cardiovascular disease, depression, suicide, and the effects pass to the next generation. Children of parents who lost their jobs to automation are more likely to be held back a grade, more likely to drop out, and have lower educational attainment throughout their lives. Carl Frey of Oxford points to a historical precedent that especially worries him. If you look back at history, there's one episode that looks very similar to what's happening now, the British Industrial Revolution, when wages didn't rise for 90 years and many people saw their standard of living fall as technology advanced. 90 years of stagnation, 3 generations. And the fifth problem, perhaps the deepest.
It has to do with what AI does to our understanding of ourselves. If a machine can write an essay indistinguishable from one written by a professor, if it can compose music that moves people, if it can solve scientific problems that stumped thousands of researchers, if it can carry on a conversation that makes a person feel understood and heard, then what remains ours? What remains uniquely human? What separates us from a very good next word predictor? Maybe the answer is consciousness, subjective experience, what philosophers call what it's like to be something. What it's like to be a human watching a sunset. What it's like to be a child taking a first step. What it's like to be in love. Even if a machine can describe a sunset better than you can, it doesn't see it. It doesn't feel the warmth on its skin. It doesn't experience the moment. At least we think so. At least we have no reason to think otherwise. At least, not yet. Geoffrey Hinton, the very same Hinton who spent decades fighting for neural networks, in 2023 left Google to speak freely about the risks of AI. He said he partly regrets his life's work. He compared himself to Oppenheimer, a man who created something incredibly powerful and now isn't sure the consequences will be good. Yoshua Bengio, another godfather of deep learning, expressed deep concern as well. "I think democracy is at risk from the progress of these tools," he said, "if we don't improve our social norms and elevate our collective wisdom at a planetary level." Hassabis warns, "We need a lot more people to take this seriously and really think about it. This is serious. It worries me a great deal." And he adds an analogy that sticks. If you received a letter saying that a more advanced alien civilization was about to arrive on Earth, every government would immediately convene emergency meetings. We'd go into full mobilization mode.
The arrival of AI is an event of comparable magnitude, but we're reacting very differently. Hassabis estimates that reaching AGI, Artificial General Intelligence, a system capable of performing any cognitive task a human can, is maybe a dozen major breakthroughs away. Not 100, a dozen. And the pace of innovation is accelerating. Shane Legg, DeepMind's co-founder, goes further. He says, "What worries me is not that AGI is far away. What worries me is the opposite, that it will arrive faster than we can prepare for it." And he adds a thought that sends chills down the spine. It's genuinely impossible for us to imagine the outputs of a super-intelligent entity. It's like asking a gorilla to imagine what Einstein is doing when he creates the theory of relativity. We built a mirror to see our own mind. And now, as the reflection in the mirror grows sharper and sharper, we discover that the mirror is also a window into a future we cannot predict, and one that may determine whether we remain masters of our own fate
or cede that role to something we ourselves created? Well, here we are. We've come a long way, from pebbles in the dust to neural networks with hundreds of billions of parameters. From Hephaestus forging golden handmaidens on mythical Olympus, to a team of engineers in London predicting the structures of 200 million proteins and giving the results away for free. From Pascal building 50 prototypes of a gear-driven calculator, to GPUs training models that write poetry and solve math problems. From Turing chaining his mug to a radiator so nobody would steal it, to a world where hundreds of millions of people talk daily to his intellectual descendants. What strikes me most about this entire story is how profoundly human it is. Every breakthrough came from a specific person, usually stubborn, slightly obsessed, often misunderstood. Ada Lovelace saw poetry in a machine that hadn't even been built yet. Turing imagined a device that could think before anyone knew how to build one. McCarthy gave the field a name and a mission. Rosenblatt built the first artificial neuron. Minsky and Papert buried it. Hinton brought it back to life. Hassabis and Legg bet their careers on a dream people laughed at. And none of them acted alone. Behind every great name stand hundreds and thousands of engineers, students, lab assistants whose names history hasn't remembered, but whose work made everything possible. None of it was inevitable. At every step, things could have gone differently. Different decisions, different funding, different personalities, and the world you live in would look completely different. Samuel might not have built his checkers program. Minsky might not have written that book. Hinton might have given up in the 80s. Hassabis might have taken Peter Molyneux's offer of £1 million and never gone to Cambridge. Every one of these folks could have sent the story in another direction. And the story isn't over. It's being written right now, by people in labs and garages and university dorms all over the world. People who look at the tools we have today the way Babbage looked at his difference engine, not as a culmination, but as a beginning. Something to build on, something to make better. We started this conversation with the observation that we were building a mirror. 50 years if you count from the formal birth of the field. 2,500 years if you count from the first questions about the nature of thinking. And throughout that journey, every new step in building a thinking machine taught us something new about ourselves. The perceptron taught us that the brain is not a logic machine but a learning system. Eliza taught us that we desperately want to see minds even where there are none. The AI Winters taught us that science is subject to fads and prejudice. Deep Blue taught us that computation and understanding are different things. AlphaGo taught us that there's more hidden in our own games than we could see. AlphaFold showed us that AI can be a gift, not a threat. And GPT has posed a question we still can't answer. What separates us from a very good imitation? Maybe the wisest thing anyone has said came from McCarthy in one of his last interviews. I just don't know how long it will take. But I don't find the arguments of the critics who say it's impossible in principle to be convincing. I don't see why human intelligence is something that humans can never understand. This is, ultimately, a project of self-knowledge, the most ambitious of all. The very project that, according to legend, Socrates called for 2,500 years ago. Know thyself. Only now, instead of merely asking questions, we're building tools that help us look for answers. Tools that sometimes show us what we didn't want to see.
And that may one day show us things we didn't even suspect. And right now, as you're lying in the dark, and your thoughts are beginning to slow, and the weight of the day is gradually letting go, let me leave you with this. Right now, at this very moment, your brain is doing everything we talked about. 86 billion neurons processing my words, turning sounds into meaning. Your memory is consolidating, the impressions of the day quietly settling into their places. Your synapses are restructuring, Connections that were active today growing stronger, unused ones fading. Your brain is literally rewriting its own architecture every night while you sleep. No computer in the world does this. No neural network restructures itself in the course of operation the way your brain is doing right now. We've built machines that can beat the best chess players, predict the structures of proteins, and write essays indistinguishable from human ones.
And yet we still can't explain how a 3-year-old learns a new word, how a person in love recognizes the footsteps of the person they love by the sound in the hallway, how you, right now, know that you're comfortable and that it's time to sleep. The most complex things your brain does are the ones you never notice, the ones that happen quietly, in the background, without effort. And they remain far beyond what our best machines can do. The mirror we've been building all these years has shown us a great deal. It has shown us that we're smarter than we thought, and at the same time, that our intelligence is organized nothing like we assumed. It has shown us that we're vulnerable, ready to be fooled by the illusion of understanding. It has shown us that we're stubborn, capable of believing in an idea for decades while the whole world says we're wrong. It has shown us that we're generous, willing to give away the fruits of our labor for free if we believe it will help. And it has shown us that we're still full of questions without answers. Maybe that's the most human thing of all. Not the ability to answer, the ability to ask. Not the ability to solve, the ability to wonder. Not the result, the curiosity that drives us toward it. Machines can already do a great deal, and every year they'll be able to do more. But being amazed by what they can do, that's something only we know how to do, for now. So let this question, what makes us us, stay with you a little longer. Not as anxiety, not as a philosophical puzzle demanding an immediate solution, but as something warm and quiet that you can carry with you into sleep. As a reminder that we live in an astonishing time. A time when the mirror that took millennia to build is finally beginning to show something. And what it shows may frighten us, may inspire us, may leave us at a loss. But it will certainly not leave us unchanged. Tomorrow, when you wake up, the machines will keep learning. Somewhere in a data center, a neural network will be processing data it hasn't seen before. Somewhere, an engineer will be debugging a model that doesn't work the way it should. Somewhere, a graduate student will be sitting up until 3 in the morning, rechecking results that don't add up. And then, they'll walk outside and see the sunrise and think, maybe I should try it this way. And maybe that this way will turn out to be the breakthrough that 10 years from now will be in every textbook. Or maybe not. Maybe the next breakthrough is still far off. Maybe the road to understanding intelligence, our own and the machines, is longer than it seems. And that's fine too. This story has been going on for 2,500 years. It's in no hurry. And right now, you don't need to think about anything. Don't need to decide anything. Don't need to remember anything. Your brain, this incredible, incomprehensible, unmatched organ in the known universe, will take care of everything on its own. It will filter out what matters, let go of what doesn't, strengthen what's worth remembering. And it will do all of this quietly, while you sleep, with an elegance that is still beyond our best algorithms. We built a mirror to see our mind, and the most astonishing thing we've seen so far is how beautiful it is. With all its limitations, with all its vulnerability, with all its inexplicable, stubborn, endlessly curious beauty. Good night. The machines will keep learning in the morning, and you already know how to do something no machine has learned yet. You know how to fall asleep, to let go, to trust the dark, and to wake up in the morning a slightly different person than you were yesterday. That's enough. That's more than enough. Among the many applications of AI that have emerged in recent years, one strikes me as an especially vivid illustration of both the potential and the duality of this technology. And it concerns something that literally touches every one of us: health. At Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, Dr. Connie Lehman, head of the Breast Imaging Center, had been watching a statistic that hadn't budged in decades. 40,000 women a year die of breast cancer in the United States alone, and a large portion of those deaths could have been prevented if the cancer had been caught earlier. When cancer is found early, it's cured. When it's found late, then comes the grueling chemotherapy, and the odds drop sharply. Nearby, at MIT, Professor Regina Barzilay, a specialist in AI who studied how to teach computers to understand language and analyze text data, received her own diagnosis in 2012: breast cancer. And the first thing she did was start asking her doctors questions. Could this have been caught earlier? Were there signs on previous mammograms that were missed? The doctors, excellent doctors, the best in Boston, couldn't answer. They didn't have the tools to analyze the data retrospectively and find patterns that preceded the diagnosis. Barzilay was convinced that if you analyzed a large enough body of mammograms using deep learning algorithms, a computer could find early signs that the human eye misses. Together with Lehman, they began the slow, painstaking process of obtaining access to thousands of mammograms and medical records from the hospital archives. The early results were striking. The system learned to predict which women truly needed surgical intervention and which could safely avoid it. For a certain type of high-risk lesion that was typically treated surgically, the algorithm showed that most patients didn't need the operation. They didn't have cancer.
The system could separate those who truly needed surgery from those who could be spared unnecessary stress and risk. Lehman said, "This is going to change the face of breast cancer. We've become so accustomed to this disease that we've almost stopped believing anything can change. We think all our efforts should go to chemotherapy for women with metastatic cancer. But when we find it early, we cure it, without the devastating consequences." Here's the mirror, in the most literal sense. A mammogram is an image, a picture. For decades, doctors looked at these pictures and tried to see signs of cancer, and missed them. Not because they were bad doctors, but because the human eye has limits. We see what we're used to seeing. We notice patterns we're familiar with. And early signs of cancer on a mammogram may be so subtle, so unlike what the doctor expects to see, that they slip right past.
A neural network trained on thousands of mammograms with known outcomes, where cancer appeared a year, 2 years, 3 years after the image, can learn to see what humans can't. Not because it's smarter than the doctor, but because it processes information differently. It has no biases, it doesn't get tired, it doesn't get distracted, and it can spot a pattern so subtle that no human could put it into words, yet nonetheless real. After AlphaGo and AlphaZero, the next step was to make the system even more universal. Chess, Go, Shogi, these are all games of perfect information, where both players see the entire board and take turns. The real world doesn't work that way. In the real world, information is incomplete. Decisions are made in real time. Opponents are unpredictable. And DeepMind decided to tackle a game that was closer to this reality: StarCraft. StarCraft is a real-time strategy game where you command an army, build bases, gather resources, and fight an opponent. Unlike chess or Go, there are no turns. Decisions are made continuously, every second. Moreover, you can't see what your opponent is doing. Their part of the map is hidden by the fog of war. And there is no single optimal strategy. Everything depends on what the opponent does. This is far more like the real world, where information is always incomplete, time is always limited, and opponents are always unpredictable. DeepMind's engineers drew inspiration from the large language models. those same next word prediction models we already talked about. Only here the agent learned to predict not the next word, but the next action in StarCraft. It watched the screen and decided, what would a professional player do right now? One of the researchers, Dan, the best StarCraft player at DeepMind, played against the agent every day for several weeks and felt it getting stronger by the day. When the agent beat Dan, it was a huge achievement for the team. The next step was to invite a professional player. They invited Manar, a professional player of the highest caliber, and arranged a public exhibition match streamed live from London. AlphaStar at that point had beaten 10 out of 10 professional players in closed matches. Manar sat down to play, and AlphaStar dictated the pace. Commentators were amazed. It feels like I'm watching a pro player through AlphaStar's eyes. But, and this is also an important part of the story, Manar adapted, found a weakness, discovered that in certain situations the agent lost its bearings. And he beat AlphaStar in the final game. Hassabis was pleased with the loss. To be honest, I think this is a fairer reflection of where we actually are, he said. For him, it was important not to create an illusion of omnipotence. AI is strong, but not invincible. And perhaps most importantly, you have to be careful. The move fast and break things approach is exactly what we should not be doing, Hassabis said after the match. We cannot afford to break things first and fix them later. In those words, there's an echo of the parallel many have drawn between DeepMind and the Manhattan Project, between Hassabis and Oppenheimer, both unleashing a new force for humanity, both understanding that this force could be used for good or for ill. The difference, in Hassabis's view, is that Oppenheimer and his colleagues got too caught up in the process of creating the technology and the question, is it possible? And didn't think early enough about the moral dimension of what they were doing. Hassabis wants to do it differently. When DeepMind was acquired by Google, Hassabis secured a promise that the technologies they developed would not be used by the military or for mass surveillance. He understood that the potential for abuse was enormous, wars that happen faster than humans can comprehend, surveillance systems more powerful than anything from Orwell's fiction, autonomous weapons. How can you permanently maintain control over something that is much stronger than you? He asked. And yet Hassabis is convinced that stopping progress is neither possible nor desirable. AGI, Artificial General Intelligence, will arrive regardless of whether DeepMind creates it or someone else does. That much is inevitable. And so the tools to protect us must be built in advance. That will require global coordination, cooperation between countries, companies, researchers. And, Hassabis says, his concern is that humanity is getting worse at this, not better. Hassabis estimates that maybe a dozen major breakthroughs separate us from AGI. Not 100, a dozen. And the pace of innovation is accelerating. It's like a boulder we've pushed off a hill, and it keeps picking up speed, he says. His lifelong dream, as he puts it. The goal of my entire life is to solve the problem of artificial general intelligence, and along the way, use it to solve the hardest scientific problems in the world. And then he adds, one of the thoughts that keeps me up at night is the fear of missing the chance to truly change the world. This is, perhaps, the most human thing I've heard from anyone working in AI. Not ambition, not greed. The fear of not having enough time. The fear that life might be shorter than the task. How many billions would you trade for 5 more years to finish what you started? We build thinking machines because our own brains are finite, because we die, because life is short and the questions are large. And somewhere deep in this drive, not the technical drive but the existential one, lies the most human of all motivations. We want to understand. We want to leave behind something that will keep thinking when we're gone. We want our curiosity to outlive us. And if that isn't humanity, I don't know what is.